The Kentucky Meat Shower, a story that, although at this point I think I've come to the most probable conclusion of, no, it's not aliens. Out of everything I've covered on this channel so far, it definitely has the highest quantity of proposed theories, if you'd even call them that, alongside it. To put it a little lightly, a lot of people put their imaginations to work when they heard of this. There were some theories proposed even in the first accounts of the story that you see, which even hold up today, in fairness. There have been a lot of theories proposed in the 150 years or so since the incident, and I feel like they've gotten worse and worse over time. And for the fun of it, I even tried to determine if it was just a part of a bigger phenomenon that I'm currently looking into. You'll know what I mean later, so stick around for that. Addressing the commonly referred to title of this story, Kentucky Meat Shower, the jokes and absurdity of it kinda tell themselves, you know. I wanted to use that as an opportunity to have a bit more fun in this video, but I've heard all of the jokes so many times that they're not funny to me anymore. I feel cursed. Like, if I told this story to somebody I knew and they were like, huh, Kentucky Meat Shower, that sounds like something that happened to your mom, it'd go right through one ear and out through the other, and I'd just end up asking their thoughts on, like, the vulture vomit theory or something. But at this point, I should definitely begin explaining this mysterious incident that I keep ominously referring to. Let's begin. This story is best introduced by telling you about our primary witness, Rebecca Crouch. Miss Crouch, by Friday, March 3rd, 1876, the day this incident would occur, was a woman entering her elder years, a wife, a mother of a few children, residing in the small Kentucky town of Olympian Springs in Bath County. She had a seemingly simple and standard American rural life, as her only recorded appearances outside of this incident would be various mentions in censuses and her family's obituaries. Quite ordinary, and around noon on that aforementioned day, March 3rd, 1876, it would quite bluntly just rain meat on her, nearly 40 pounds of what should presumably be forecasted at zero. After the initial cleanup and interactions with the people in the town, within that week, the story would spread throughout the entire county, and beyond that time frame it would permeate across the whole country, with reporters coming to prod the townsfolk with as many questions as they could. The first publications of the story that I came across date March 9th and March 10th, from various Kentucky and New York newspapers, who would lay out the basic summaries of the stories. The most detailed accounts come from a newspaper correspondent that sent interviews and descriptions to both the Louisville Courier-Journal and the New York Herald on March 20th and March 21st, respectively. In order to convey the necessary information to you, I will be reading primarily from the Herald, as it contains a well-elaborated word-for-word testimony by Mrs. Crouch. There felt like no point in trying to summarize, in my own words, what our primary source was able to say just fine on her own. This article, and some bits from the Louisville Courier-Journal, do contain accounts from locals who saw it at the aftermath, but I deemed it appropriate to simply just summarize what they said for the sake of your time. The New York Herald, Tuesday, March 21st, 1876. The Carnal Rain. After documenting his journey to the springs in the prior paragraphs, his interview with Mrs. Crouch begins. Mrs. Crouch, I have been sent here to learn all the particulars about the remarkable shower of flesh which is reported to have fallen on this place in your presence a few days ago, and I hope you will be kind enough to give me a full and truthful statement of all you saw on the day it fell. I will do that, sir, cheerfully. Thank you. I will begin. Then, by asking you a few questions pertaining to the occurrence, and after I am through with the interrogatories, I will ask you to dictate, while I write down, any statement that you may please to make. That mode of procedure meets with my approval, and I am ready to begin if you are. I am quite ready and have only further to request you will not state anything that you would not be willing to substantiate by oath. I will tell you nothing but the solemn truth. Can you estimate, either by weight or measurement, the quantity of flesh that fell the other day? I can't say exactly how much there was, but I think there was not less than half a bushel. Did he remain in the yard for the commencement until the ending of the shower? I did not. I became alarmed and fled to the house. Did you observe any blood upon the pieces that you examined? Why, sir, I never examined any of it or touched it, but Mr. Crouch and the children say that the chips and fence rails upon which it fell were stained with something that looked like blood. Did it smell different from any other meat? I did not smell it. Was it quivering, or did it show any signs of recent life when it fell? I did not notice any. How did the event impress you at first? I became very nervous and unusually alarmed. Where do you think it came from? The Lord only knows. When I saw it, it was coming straight and sloping down. Are you certain it fell from the clouds? I am not. All I know about it is that it came from some place above my head. What became of the flesh after it had fallen? Well, it fell between 11 and 12 o'clock and lay upon the ground until late in the afternoon, when my husband and son, who were away at the time, returned. Mr. Crouch was told all about it. He then went out and picked up a great many pieces, and I heard that before that time the hogs, chickens, cat, and dog had been eating it freely and seemed to like it well. Have you thought much about the occurrence, and have you any theory of your own as to the origin or import of the event? I have thought of it a heap, and it is the greatest mystery to me in the world. Have any other newspaper correspondents besides myself visited you to get your statement about the affair? No, sir. You are the only representative of the press that I have seen or that ever spoke to me in reference to it. You said a while ago that the meat was eaten by the cats, dogs, hogs, and chickens. Did it have any peculiar effect upon them? Well, I have not noticed anything unusual among them since. Only the dog became very sick the other day, and is now very badly off. But I could not say it was the meat that made him so. But I never knew him to be this way before. After the foregoing questions had been replied to by Mrs. Crouch, as stated, we again walked out into the yard and took another survey of the premises. There stood the soap kettle, the traditional ash hopper, the well, and a hen house, over all of which the flesh is said to have fallen. A rail fence divided in about equal parts the area over which they said the shower fell. About 1/2 mile east of the house is the summit of the mountain, the elevation of which is probably 700 feet above the level of the valley. Returning to the house, we asked Mrs. Crouch to make a statement of the occurrence in her own words, telling her that we would record all she said in her own exact language. To this proposition she assented, and commenced as follows. On Friday morning, March 3rd, between the hours of 11 and 12 o'clock, I was in my yard not more than 40 steps from the door of the room in which we are now sitting. The skies were clear and the sun was shining brightly. There was a light wind coming from a westerly direction, without any prelude or warning, and exactly under these circumstances the shower commenced. The fall was not less than 1 nor more than 2 minutes' duration. I never touched any of the flesh until my husband came home. I noticed little whirlwinds in the mountains during the morning and predicted rain from that fact. When the flesh began to fall, I said to my grandson, who was the only person in the yard with me at the time, "What is that falling, Alan?" He looked up at me and said, "Why, Grandma, it's snowing." I then walked around and saw a large piece of it strike the ground right behind me, with a snapping-like noise when it struck. A vague idea that my husband and son, who were away, had been torn to pieces and their remains were being brought home to me in this way by the wind, hashed through my mind at the moment. I was also impressed with the conviction that it was a miracle of God, which as yet we do not understand. It may have been a warning, as coming events are said to cast their shadows before. The largest piece that I saw was as long as my hand and about 1/2 inch wide. It looked gristly, as if it had been torn from the throat of some animal. Another piece that I saw was half round in shape and about the size of a $half. Your correspondent then informed Mrs. Crouch that a rumor was circulating in Mount Sterling to the effect that she and her husband had quarreled several times recently about selling the farm, she being in favor of and he being opposed to making a sale, and that she had done this flesh trick in order to scare the old man into her way of thinking, and thereby accomplish by fright what she could not perform by persuasion. At this revelation they all laughed, and it seemed to worry the old lady some, to think that such a mean and unworthy trick should be imputed to her. She soon rallied and settled that point in the following words. "It is true that I want to sell the place, but I have never quarreled with Mr. Crouch about the matter. He is more anxious to sell than I am. Mr. Crouch was present and said he would like to sell out and move to Indiana, where he had a son living, and he thought he could live better there and not work half so hard." Following that whole interaction, the newspaper account from the New York Herald briefly details the opinion of 11 others, mostly locals. The first, and probably the most important, supplementary account belongs to Harrison Gill, an important landowner in the Olympian Springs area, who visited the farm 2 days after the fall. Most of his information comes from Mr. Crouch, who really was just giving a composite account of things he heard from his wife, children, and a student who was boarding there at the time. Here's some important facts from what he said. The meat fell on a 100-yard by 50-yard area excluding their house. When he first visited the farm on the Sunday 2 days after the event, he took some samples of the meat and preserved them in jars filled with alcohol. On Tuesday 2 days later, he went back to the farm to inquire further, most notably getting this information from a Miss Sadie Robinson, the student I mentioned earlier. The aftermath she described to him went as this. It fell over a patch of about 2 acres, and it was not lying on the ground as thick as sown oats, and in many places in the space inside of which it had fallen, there was none at all. The rest of his account basically just details the experiences of the Crouch grandchildren in regard to the event, that during presumably his Tuesday trip he still saw some particles scattered around, and that Miss Crouch supposedly saw a piece fall as long as her hand and about as wide as her 2 fingers. Immediately following his statement, the interviewer claims to have spoken with the aforementioned Miss Sadie Robinson, and that her statements affirmed what Mr. Gill already said, and thus was unnecessary to include. Moving forward from that, the article continues on to feature 5 different accounts from locals who all give their not particularly scientific guess on what the mystery sky meat might have been after interacting with it, each giving their own justification on various levels of assertiveness. Some of their guesses on what it was bear, mutton, and beef. 2 of the guys tasted it. Yes, they tasted the raw sky meat, giving us the ever so valuable information that it didn't really taste like anything at all. After that section of the article, it goes on to detail a theory proposed by the University of Louisville professor J.L. Smith, who asserted that the mysterious precipitation was actually frog spawn. As legend goes, he got a sample of only fat meat, but still, man, come on, get your head in the game. I will come back to and address this theory later, but for now I think the local response given in the paper suffices well. The people about Mount Sterling who have seen the substance say that Professor Smith may be right, but they think that for the interest of history, another scientist should analyze the meat and state to the world what he finds it to be. Class act from Mount Sterling, though. They were trying to be polite. A brief mention is made afterwards about some locals theorizing that it could have been either a balloonist or some vultures, saying this. One man says the meat might have fallen from the lunch basket of a passing balloonist. Another explains it by attributing it to buzzards, which being too full as they winged their flight over the farm, just disgorged themselves, and the result was a shower of flesh. One of these theories became the dominant one over the 150 years since. Take a guess, and we'll get back to it soon. There was this really out-of-place bit at the end of the article where they're trying to coerce an Irishman into eating it. It's just really weird to read. I had to mention it somehow. The correspondent from this article also communicated with the Louisville Courier-Journal. The only exclusive details it offers are more apocryphal accounts of what happened in the story. Things like Mr. Crouch describing it as slices of catfish, Mrs. Crouch supposedly seeing fingernails or toenails attached to it, Another story of someone eating the mysterious raw sky meat, someone touching the meat and supposedly getting paralyzed, and someone really angrily insisting that it is mutton. A lot of it seems really hearsay, so take them with as much salt as you can stomach. I will be referring back to details in these two accounts as I discuss the theories for the rest of the video. Some of those theories I've already mentioned, some I haven't, but I want you to be familiar with the most important sources before I begin. First, I want to say some initial thoughts after giving you that big of an info dump. My first thing to emphasize would be is that this is a real historical event. The way I've heard some people describe it have these really fictional or mythological undertones to it. And although I don't think that was intentional on anyone's part, and I've tried not to do it within my own video, that can often make it sound like I'm telling you a story and not actually investigating a real event. There are just too many documented witnesses and samples to say that this didn't happen. The second thing I would like to emphasize is that I believe much of the media around this case tends to over-exaggerate it a lot. I haven't verbally acknowledged this yet. Perhaps in editing I've already displayed some of the images or videos artistically depicting the event. If I haven't, they should be showing up on screen now. But I'd assert that this event wasn't actually that grandiose. It is often depicted as just this bombardment of flesh, some pieces the size of cats and dogs, that come together to paint the vicinity in this unrecoverable layer of meat. The first accounts of the story really strike a different note. The quantity of flesh it is described by Mrs. Crouch is at least a half bushel, or about 17.5 liters, or if it was a leaner cut of meat, around 40.5 pounds of meat. The longest piece described is about the length of her hand, and the most massive piece, as in just weight, was probably this one described in a March 10th New York Times article that was about 3 or 4 inches square, so not that grand in my opinion. I was really close into breaking into a whole rant about what happens when you let the AI content farms get a hold of this story, but I'll bide my tongue, I suppose. I know I kind of downplayed it all there, but I do still want to emphasize that, any meat raining down from the heavens is beautifully anomalous to someone like me. But keep that admittedly less impressive scale in mind as we discuss the theories from this point forward. Almost all of the most credible theories appeared in that primary article that I showed you. And within that very article, the first attempt at an explanation given is the hypothesis that it could have been a hoax. We see this first demonstrated in an earlier part of the article that I didn't show you, where the correspondent had this interaction with a local. What do you think about it? Well, sir, it's a mystery to me. Don't you think that Miss Crouch is deceiving the people about this matter? Oh, no, sir. She is too good a woman to be guilty of anything of that kind. Then you believe all that she says about this wonderful occurrence? I do, sir. She would not deceive anybody about anything. Later on in the interview section of the article, this issue comes up again. Recall back to her closing statements. It is true that I want to sell the place, but I have never quarreled with Mr. Crouch about the matter. He is more anxious to sell than I am. Going on even further, this interaction was given in the interview with the local butcher, I.G. Frisch. Frizz, do you know Miss Crouch who lives out near Olympian Springs? If you do, tell me what kind of a woman you think she is. I know the whole family. They are members of a church, are good people, and I believe everything that they say about this meat business is as true as gospel. When the opinions of those who knew her were asked, they seemed to assume that she was innocent, and she herself gave a pretty natural reaction in my opinion. But I do believe that the thing that really exonerates her is the practicality and logistics of what would need to happen in order for this to be a lie. It comes down to motive, resources, and conspiratorial implications. Beginning with the question of why would she have done this? Assuming the main motive is to move to Indiana, as stated within the article. And it doesn't even seem like they did ever move, since there's a crouch grave site near the immediate area where their property was. And if your wife was willing to fake a whole meat shower in order to get you to move, I have a feeling she's not going to stop there, and he lived a few years after that. So she'd have to be both persistent enough to fake a meat shower, whilst also be willing to give up after that didn't work. I can't even really think of what another possible motive may have been. Remember, this is 1876. You can't easily do some weird prank or street interview, have it go viral, and make a career out of it. There just isn't really a good reason for her to have done this with the context we're aware of. Recall back to the quantity being around 17.5 liters of meat. Assuming it was like horse meat or something, which people probably wouldn't have considered that valuable, we have a weight of around 40.5 pounds, and it doesn't really change too much depending on the kind of meat. But if it was of the equestrian variety, which, as I said, probably wouldn't have been too expensive, it would have costed about $3.25, or about $100 today. Forgive me for stereotyping here a little bit, but seeing that they were a homesteading family out in some of the most rural parts of Kentucky, I suspect that she wouldn't be too eager to waste that kind of money on a trick that might work, especially when you consider that she was trying to do this in the effort to move to another state. It would also just require a lot of effort to spread all of the meat around her property, making it look natural, whilst also having to invite the girl school boarding with them, at least one of her grandchildren, probably some of the locals, and whoever she bought the meat from, into a conspiracy against her husband, all in time before he got home. A lot of work for an older lady, so I think the logistics required for it to be a hoax on her behalf, they seem impossible to me. Theory 2. God did it. Snuggled in between those mentions of her being surrounded with implications of deception is her statement that, I was also impressed with the conviction that it was a miracle of God, which as yet we do not understand. It may have been a warning, as coming events are said to cast their shadows before. Coming from a Christian, I disagree that the meat shower was miraculous. I think that this specifically was an exclusively natural event. As for her statement about this being a potential warning for something, any Christian you ask kinda has to lie on a spectrum between God predestines everything, yes, literally everything, to he just permits everything to happen and sometimes intervenes. I lie at about here on the spectrum, so while I don't really believe in coincidences or luck, I can't exactly call this a warning because I have no clue what on earth it would be a warning for. My brothers, listen up. Not everything has to have a super deep meaning. Theory 3. What if it wasn't meat? Scrolling a bit further into the article, we return back to Professor Lawrence J. Smith's theory that he would summarize in an earlier paper as, the Bath County celestial meat was dead spawn of frogs, transported from swamps by the wind. I have grouped this as a part of a larger accumulation of theories that appeared in the aftermath of the event that I've referred to as the "it's not what it looks like" theories. I saw some suggestions that this may have been the result of clusters of insect larvae or unspecified bacteria colonies going airborne only to fall back on the ground. But easily the most circulated theory of this variety, first introduced by a New York water treatment specialist named Leopold Brandes, was that the substance that fell was something called nostoc. They are colonies of algae that can have a semi-translucent and gelatinous-like appearance, which in fairness might seem similar to like fat tissue. He describes nostoc as growing very rapidly after being exposed to rain, leading many to mistake it as, falling straight from the sky. Interesting theory, except for the fact that there are no reports of rain prior to the event. There are people who witnessed it falling from the sky, and that this would eventually be confirmed to literally just be meat. The story of how it eventually got confirmed to be meat is pretty interesting and complicated, but also kind of out of the scope for this video, which is really funny coming from the guy who just made a whole segment explaining why the Kentucky meat shower was probably not a miracle from God. There are some good articles from it on antiqueslides.net and microscopics.net if you care. But to summarize some of the contemporary conclusions given by scientists within the Louisville Medical News in the American Journal of Microscopy, the samples showed muscular fiber, cartilage, connective fatty, and structureless tissue, thus being plainly of animal origin. Interestingly, these people too also agreed on some of the locals that it could have been mutton, like them primarily on the basis of odor, but there are also some less confirmable claims that there were like strands of wool woven into the meat. And according to a letter in the New York medical record, which for the life of me I could just not get a hold of, they thought their sample could have been lung tissue from either a horse or a human infant. Given the amount of meat that fell, that would be like anywhere from 2 to 4 children. So if there wasn't an animal dying out in a field somewhere, somebody was getting up to something. Anyway, the exact kind of meat isn't really that important unless it actually, was baby meat. But the important thing is that it limits the remaining theories into an amount that's a lot more digestible. Theory 4, balloon prank terrorism. Towards the end of the article, there are 2 theories from unnamed sources, that it was dropped from either a balloon or some birds. I'll begin with the balloonist theory, and as a preparatory statement, it might seem like I'm putting, a lot of unnecessary effort into something that, intuitively feels just kind of wrong, but the logistics that I build up here will eventually be reapplied to the vulture theory, so I'm going to be slowly building up my case for that. So, spoiler alert, I don't believe in the balloonist theory, but pay attention anyway. Consider these 3 things. No historical data, the question of why you would have so much meat on a hot air balloon, and the idea that Miss Crouch and her grandson probably would have still seen that hot air balloon. As for the historicity, during the surrounding time period of the incident, I found no references to ballooning or balloonist within the entire state of Kentucky. And even for just the term balloon, there were only 4 hits on the term, each in counties way too far away. Still, there's no reason to assume that it would have to be historically documented in some way, so you do still have to account for motive. And just, by the way, whoever the man they interviewed for that balloon theory definitely was not there. As he put it, the meat might have fallen from the lunch basket of a passing balloonist. Like I said, my boy probably did not have a good opportunity to grasp both the quantity and quality of the meat, because, you don't really bring 40.5 pounds of raw meat on a hot air balloon for lunch. So the only other motive I could possibly conceive of is that this was somebody doing this simply out of the most pure trolling spirit in history. Which, you know what, I'm sure there are plenty of people nowadays who would love to pull something like this off. But with some of the info delivered in the article, I'd still label this theory as an impossibility. Why so? Recall that some of the meat is described as being particulate in a way. In my head, I almost imagine it as like a dust or a mist or something like that. It is described in multiple accounts as in some way falling similar to snow. Combine that with Miss Crouch's mention of a light westerly wind, I'd assert that we do have enough info to claim that the balloon couldn't have been that high. Follow my logic. As the pieces of meat were falling from whatever entity dropped them, a light westerly wind, or probably an even stronger one if they were really high up, would have been applied to them. The larger and more heavy pieces would have been affected by that wind less, and thus been able to continue a more natural trajectory. The smaller particle or snowflake-like pieces described would have been affected by it a lot more, and thus been sent on a trajectory beyond that of the more compact pieces. What seems to be described, however, is that both the more massive and more particulate samples seem to drop in the same general perimeter. This is best demonstrated by Harrison Gill's one mention of where those smaller particles fell. A fence, seemingly the same one described earlier in the article as separating in half the affected area. So, unless if on one of those sides there just weren't any sizable pieces, which I think they would have noticed since it was half of the entire area, then their perimeters had to overlap, at least mostly, which encourages the idea that they didn't drop for long enough to significantly separate in distance. And while I don't have enough info to give an estimate at what height the meat may have dropped from, I hope you trust my intuition enough to assume with me that this hypothetical drop height was still low enough to where either an elderly lady or her grandson could see an entity at that height, which is reasonable in my opinion. Given how quickly wind speed can rise with altitude, I'd actually just assume it had to be within like a few hundred feet of the ground. This isn't particularly much info to go off of yet, but it's just enough to continue building our case a little bit further. So stick with me here. I want to continue harping on that mention of, as Miss Crouch put it, a light wind coming from a westerly direction. I don't know exactly what her standard would be for a light wind, but I feel comfortable assuming it was maybe like a 2 on the Beaufort scale. So anywhere from like 3 to 6 mile per hour wind speeds. And just by the nature of how they work, a hot air balloon and 3 to 6 mile per hour wind speeds would of course be traveling around 3 to 6 miles per hour. Assuming that the hypothetical balloon traveled the 100 yards in distance and spread it over 50 yards in width, under those wind speeds it should take them anywhere from 33 to 67 seconds to travel that distance. If the measurements were inverted and they traveled 50 yards and spread it over 100 yards, the time would be in half, of course. At first I thought it might be even a logistical stretch in and of itself to haul that much torn meat out of a balloon within that time frame, especially on the lower end of those estimates, but I think that could be accounted for with the possibility that there could be multiple perpetrators. And going back to that 3 to 6 mile per hour metric, or about 1.5 to 3 yards per second, which as a disclaimer I'm going to be using primarily yards for all of my measurements at this point. That's how the people in the case described everything, so I kinda unintentionally started doing it too, and now all of my math is in yards for my notes. I hate doing math in Imperial, but that's what you get for this video, I guess. Other measurements should just be on screen. Anyway, with that 1.5 to 3 yards per second, I will be applying some rather uncertain math to it, but even under the most favorable possible estimate you could give to the balloon theory, it still works out in a way that it is impossible for me to have dropped from a balloon traveling 3 to 6 miles per hour without being seen, under the circumstances given in the article. Here's my reasoning. Any object falling from the sky to Earth will travel at 9.8 meters per second squared, or in these calculations, 10.72 yards per second squared, if there was no air resistance. But because I don't know any individual piece of meat's drag force, terminal velocity, or when it would reach that terminal velocity, which would require me to know all its dimensions and the orientation and speed of which it was dropped, I will, in an effort to give some benefit of the doubt to the theory, I will be as sour and pessimistic as possible with how fast I think the meat will accelerate. And more accurately in these calculations, I will assume that it literally just won't accelerate at all, and it will follow a stagnant 10.72 yards per second. In which, to cut some slack to me, the meat is often described as being in a strip-like state. So chances are most of the samples probably are pretty air resistant, probably not that air resistant. I'm not a physicist, but if you have reason to believe the meat would fall even slower than that, tell me, but that seemed like a reasonable enough floor to base my estimates at. Anyway, let's take those two figures, the upper limit on the balloon speed, 3 yards per second, and my flat 10.72 yards per second estimate on how slow the meat might have fallen. This is like the best case scenario for the balloon theory. I want to reiterate that. But even under these idyllic conditions, for every yard that the balloon was able to travel away from their crime scene, the meat would have traveled downward about 3 yards to 3.5 yards. I'll be even more generous and round it down to 3. So simple 6th grade algebra of falling 3 and running 1, which essentially results in that no matter what height the meat was dropped from, it would remain in the visible range of somebody looking straight up, which I'm treating as a basic 120-degree field of vision, so mid-peripheral range. Even if it took Miss Crouch and her grandson, let's say, like 10 seconds to react, allowing the balloon to travel an extra 30 yards, which does seem reasonable based off of the interaction we see between Miss Crouch and her grandson. That extra little grace period doesn't give the balloon any more room to fly away beyond an altitude of like 20 yards, which is close enough to where I'd kind of hope that they'd be able to notice a balloon flying that low. But at the same time, I don't think my argument is broken by that little sliver of room that a potential balloon theorist could genuinely try to argue for. But given that Kentucky's two most common trees can pretty easily reach heights of 80 to 100 feet, I suspect that potential balloon pranksters wouldn't be too eager to fly that close to the ground anyway. A balloon theory, although weirdly hard to definitively disprove, is ultimately impossible to me. But the reasoning behind why I believe it's wrong provides a useful rubric to judge some of the other theories on. Most relevantly, the aforementioned vulture vomit theory. Before I apply the logistics I built up here to that, though, I want to begin constructing that case using another piece of evidence, which involves me introducing to you a larger pattern of stories like this that I've begun to refer to in my notes as ORP, organic rain phenomena, incidents of whole animals, plants, flesh, or other organic material falling from the sky. And by definition, this is an ORP, organic matter fell from the sky, but not in a particularly interesting way that I think would lend itself to other theories. Among some other distinctions, one of the way I try to classify different ORP cases is by trying to determine whether they would be considered assisted or unassisted. Basically just comes down to whether or not another organism played a part in the biomass being transported to the spot from which it fell. I feel confident that this particular incident at least had to be assisted, which tends to eliminate most of the other theories that people try to put forward, especially nowadays. Usually that it was of some meteorological cause. I've heard suggestions of anything from like a strong wind to tornadoes and water spouts. And if you're curious about this whole ORP thing that I'm trying to investigate on a larger scale, I'd encourage you to subscribe. I'm sure that by the time I get around to figuring this out in a way that I feel confident enough to present, my videos will be much higher quality than they are now. Treat it like, investing in Bitcoin in the mid-2000s, except instead of tens of millions of dollars, you get a slightly interesting video that pops up in your recommended for like a year from now. Anyway, why do I feel so confident that it had to be a assisted case? Well, take a look at the nature of what fell. First off, it's literally just meat, and it's often referred to as fresh meat. Meat tends not to just sit around for a while in nature, waiting for something to pick it up and bring it into the upper atmosphere. There are also mentions of the meat quivering in some manner, which could imply that the substance hadn't even gone into rigor mortis, which itself implies the meat probably originated from an animal that died a few hours before the meat fell. The reporting on this is admittedly a little spotty. Some sources report it, so I assume it had to come from somewhere. But Mrs. Crouch herself says that she didn't notice any. But at the same time, it's kind of debatable about how much she inspected the meat, so this point is a little up in the air in my opinion. There are two other characteristics of the meat that act less as deterrents from a meteorological theory, and more actually towards encouraging a vulture theory. Think back to some of the descriptions of the meat you've heard as I've told this story. The largest piece that I saw was as long as my hand and about half an inch wide. It was elastic and thin. In size, the pieces varied from 2 inches to 1/2 inch in length and were about 1/3 of an inch wide, thin slices of Mississippi catfish. One piece fell near her, which was 3 or 4 inches square. The pieces of flesh were various sizes and shapes, some of them being 2 inches square. little strips of flesh from 1 inch to 2 inches wide and from 1 inch to 3 inches long, and 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch in thickness. A pattern that stood out to me after reading the accounts over and over and over again is this consistent description that they appear to be like strips of meat, and when rough measurements are given, they are often two-dimensional. They lack depth. It's always length and width, and that omission of a third dimension translates a subtext to me that it wasn't particularly important. And the one account that does give thickness explicitly describes it as considerably less than the other 2 dimensions. In my opinion, these characteristics are exactly what you would expect from an animal tearing meat from another animal, and especially any type of bird with their relatively narrow and thin beaks. I'm no anatomy professor, but muscle is organized in fibers, and as such, the least resistant way for them to tear off would be in those longer strands, strips, or sheets. This last bit of evidence might kinda depend on the person and just how willing you are to trust credentials. But to quote from the Louisville Courier-Journal, a little after 2 months later on May 13th, 1876, in reference to the meat, I find also that it gives an acid reaction, a property of fish muscular tissue, and especially of meat which has been submitted to the action of the gastric juice of an animal. We incline here to the turkey buzzard theory and the probability of dead sheep. This is a letter from a Robert Peter and his microscopist assistant, Alex Parker, sent to a Captain J.M. Bent, Esquire. Those 3 who I just referred to, I've been able to determine, are real people, and they have other documented interactions with other people in the case. Me personally, I'd say I actually do trust them. It's a pretty simple thing to test as far as I can tell, and the fact that they were knowledgeable enough in whatever they were doing to be able to either suggest or just simply refer to a fish-related explanation gives me some confidence that they knew what they were doing. My first big point there about the dimensions of the meat I think is really solid evidence, while this one is probably a bit more supplemental. Neither should really be enough to make any confident claims, so let's continue further. There are about 4 or maybe 5-ish claims, depending on how you count them, that could get in the way of calling the vulture theory a reasonable explanation. I'm going to start with our reapplication of the balloon math, so let's call back to those basic presuppositions that I laid out earlier. For the balloon theory, I gave it a very generous assumption that there would be no acceleration, and even within those parameters, it failed to hold up. A turkey vulture could probably fare much better within those circumstances. They can dive at up to 60 miles per hour, but soar at about 20, given that in order to drop at least around 40 pounds of meat, given how much vultures can eat at once, especially out in the wild, you'd need at least 50, but it's probably more than that, which means they'd be traveling in a flock, which means they'd probably be soaring. So all my measurements will be going at 20 miles per hour. This also does make the most sense of the splotched-like pattern of the meat on the ground, referred to in Harrison Gill's account. The black vulture is also native to Kentucky, but I don't really have any reliable statistics on how fast they might fly. Word on the street is that it is faster than the turkey vulture, but as long as I can prove that at least one species of vulture could do this, then it's solved either way, and I'm gonna go with the ones that I have reliable measurements for. Let's continue. That 20 miles per hour translates to about 10 yards per second. Matching that to the 10.72 yards per second, I'm actually going to do the birds a favor for at least a minute here and just round it to a simple 1-to-1 ratio of falling to flying. And within these parameters, the theory actually fails. Even the vulture should always be within view. However, if we apply that same 10 or so second response time, that seemed plausible to me from the first example, which, by the way, I did not come up with that just to make the vulture theory work. I'm pretty sure I actually did originally think of that in order to try and give the balloon theory as much leeway as possible, in an effort to show why it still failed. If you're listening to my reasoning and going, okay dude, maybe according to the text, it reads as if it took them like 10 seconds to react, but chances are they probably looked up before the first report within her account. But you know what? By my own personal testimony, I strongly disagree with you. I've been pooped on by a bird before. I did not look up. It probably took me like 10 seconds to react. Nowadays, if this happened to me, if pretty much anything fell from the sky above me, I'd immediately look at me like, where are they? Where are the birds at? But you only unlock that level of derangement after putting in like dozens of hours of research into a story as dumb as this. Crazy. An apple fell on Newton's head and he figured out gravity. Bird pooped on my head. What am I doing with my life? Look at... I've been building up to talking about bird vomit for the past hour. Anyway, if a flock of vultures is given that same grace of being able to travel for 10 seconds longer, they can travel collectively about 100 yards further, which within my estimated visibility range of Mrs. Crouch and her grandson should allow some vultures to successfully fly away undetected under an altitude of about 130 yards, which is well within a vulture's standard foraging range. So is this part of the case solved? So far, I don't think so at all. Approaching it like that would be very intellectually dishonest, to give the balloon theory as much leeway as possible to prove the point that it's still wrong under the best of circumstances, and then apply those same standards to the buzzard hypothesis. I don't think that's how you should do it. Instead, I believe a much more honest and reversed approach would be to apply as much pressure as possible to the vulture theory to see if it can still hold up. Earlier I deemed to just act as if the meat wouldn't accelerate and stay at a stagnant rate, and instead this time I'll let it accelerate as much as physically possible at 10.72 yards per second squared, which is how it would be if there was no air resistance. There is air in Kentucky, so the math I'm about to describe could never actually take place, but since I don't have the info to know how much to adjust it down by, all I feel I can really even try to do is prove with this example that it doesn't even matter how much air-resistant played a factor, because if within this extreme example the vultures can still get away undetected, then within any variation of the air resistance the birds could have escaped from their sight. And under this logic, with the meat falling at 10.72 yards per second squared, in which the vulture is traveling away at 10 yards per second, and given an extra 10 seconds to travel more as Miss Crouch and her grandson react, the vultures could be reasonably expected to be out of sight from somebody looking up at anywhere or below an altitude of 70 yards, which, as an extension from earlier, is well within their foraging range. So I'd actually say a vulture theory is actually perfectly reasonable in response to the question of, well, why didn't they see it? So, case solved? Still, not yet, but we are getting closer. There are two subsequent rebuttals that can follow this from anybody who's really familiar with this case. It's an objection that I've held off from addressing so far, and it's Miss Crouch's statement that the fall was not less than 1 nor more than 2 minutes duration. At plain reading, this is the possibility to destroy any theory in the brand of a flyby bombardment, and at first I thought so too. Think about it. If the plain reading was true, that chunks of meat fell over the same space that she stood for her described period of time, that would necessarily require whatever dropped them to perform a general hover over that spot for roughly the same period of time, or for it to be a group of passing entities to all drop the meat over the same rough interval, except this time being fast enough to get away. Under both of those circumstances, the meat would have to be dropped from too high for those smaller particles to meet it at the same place on the ground. This makes just about any theory seem impossible, and quickly leads people to either aliens or multiversal wormholes. So I'll be honest with my motives here and say I pretty much had to try and find an alternative interpretation, basically out of necessity. I'll begin my approach with how to deal with this by thinking about things in terms of a timeline. First, the meat begins to fall. Second, Miss Crouch and her grandson have their interaction, and then her grandson looks up. Probably about a few seconds after that, the last reported substantial piece of meat hit the ground, and then for somewhere over a minute longer, the shower continues. The key piece of evidence that I think makes this work is that during the incident and in the aftermath, the young grandson and Mrs. Crouch would both describe it as snow respectively. Consider this. They both had physical chunks of meat fall down upon them, pretty substantial pieces, and yet despite seeing that, when asked to describe it, they said that it felt like snow? Think about it. Physical chunks of meat falling from the sky is a whole nother level of grandeur compared to just kind of a red snow is how I'm imagining it. So in order for the snow part of that to be the thing that sticks on their mind when they're asked to describe it, I believe the one thing that can make that work is that substantially more time was spent in the snow-like state, and any of the references to larger chunks of meat falling when Mrs. Crouch tells her story seem to be within that first 10, 15, maybe if you stretch it 20 seconds of the event. What I am proposing is that the majority of the meat wasn't that spectacular. It was just a red, snow-like mist slowly descending upon the farm, with the more sizable and compact chunks of meat being the first droppings that would initially get your attention, but quickly ceasing, and then in that absence, it highlights the red mist that comes afterwards, making the story, in retelling, much more grand than it actually was. I actually feel really confident in this theory, not only because I'm kind of forced to make any theory work, but because I think that once you can cast aside any preconceived notions of grandeur about this event as some absolute downpour of flesh, then my 1-2 punch theory of the attention-grabbing, solid meat chunk opening, and then the more subdued and extended blood mist closing, can very easily just be the plain reading of the text. So, story solved? Still, not yet. After working through this logic, I discovered another oversight. Take a look back at that timeline for me. The final reported substantial piece of meat fell actually a little bit past when her grandson looked up. If you've kept track of everything I've talked about in this video, this seems to kind of just reset any logic I proposed earlier back to that 10.72 yards per second square fall time to 10 yards per second escape time, a ratio that would pretty much exclusively confine the vultures to a visible range, except this time there's no grace period to escape. There are two ways I think you could potentially alleviate the concerns from that. First, consider that there could be a distance between Miss Crouch and her grandson, and two, consider the difference in distance that two differently shaped pieces dropped at the same time could accumulate as they fall. About that first point, how could that remedy this dilemma? Well, the maximum distance that could have possibly been between Miss Crouch and her grandson is 100 yards, the distance on which the meat fell. A flock of vultures, as stated many times so far, travels at around 10 yards per second, so in order to traverse that max distance between the two, it would take them about 10 seconds, which happens to line up pretty well with the parameters of their interaction time. This would allow for solid meat chunks to be falling upon Miss Crouch while her grandson had already looked into the air. Assuming it takes maybe a few seconds for the meat to fall from the bird to the ground, this works pretty well with the timeline. Is there any evidence to positively encourage this? No, not really in my opinion. You'd have to perform a mastery level eisegesis of the text in order to say that they were 100 yards away from each other. Because although 100 yards should be well within the vocal range of even an elderly woman, I feel like there would be more textual clues that indicated that if it were the case. You could make references to her referring to her grandson as just in the yard, which seems to denote a certain lack of proximity. Things like Mrs. Crouch asking her grandson to look for her, or the fact that her grandson seemingly yelled his statement that it looked like snow, but at the same time, boys his age tend to just be loud in general about everything, especially if it's interesting, and the other 2 points just aren't enough in my opinion. Here's the compromise. For every 10 yards that you think they could potentially be separated by, with Mrs. Crouch being further in the direction that the vultures would be hypothetically flying, you get one more extra second to explain why meat was falling on Mrs. Crouch after her grandson had looked up. And you need at least 10 of those in order to make this case possible under these harsher circumstances. The other way to alleviate potential concerns would be to ponder the impact air resistance could have on the fall times of two different samples. Consider these two examples. A skydiver in a belly-to-earth orientation can reach a speed of about 120 miles per hour. But even a novice skydiver in a head-up or head-down orientation can easily reach speeds of 160 miles per hour, with the world record being 373 miles per hour in 2016. All I can think about in regard to that is that one piece Miss Crouch mentioned as being as long as her hand and half an inch wide, or as wide as her 2 fingers, according to Harrison Gill. Or that other piece that was around 3 or 4 inches squared, and how if there were multiple pieces like that and they each fell at their own unique orientation, the speed difference that could have occurred from that definitely could have varied the fall time by like a few seconds, right? I know that's very speculative, and believe it or not, at one point I was trying to build a lot more of my theories, in this case around that fact. Technically shouldn't call that a fact, more of a suggestion, I suppose. But I didn't want to put that much weight on it, but for perhaps a smaller issue like this where I'm just trying to buy a few seconds if I can, I feel a little more comfortable leaning on it, because I can combine the 2 theories together in order to try and build up to that time requirement. Maybe them being like 30, 40 yards away buys a few seconds here. Maybe some of the variation in the shapes buys a few seconds there. Basically have to get at least 10 seconds in order for the theory to work. But at the same time, I also didn't even need to do any of that. I could have just encouraged a vague variety in the potential circumstances and let the ambiguity lean in my favor. Just say something like, oh, what if there was a tree or a building or the terrain was in the way? What if they had bad eyesight? What if they could have just seen the vultures, but they happened to turn their head a different way? I really did want to be able to make a positive assertion that this theory is true, not just say, what else could it be in the face of not having enough evidence? And I don't really think I was able to reach that threshold. Here's how I'll summarize the vulture theory. I think the strongest case for it starts from the nature of the meat that fell. To me, it clearly appears to be meat that in some way interacted with a vulture. The logistics of this case, as in how could a flock of vultures vomit on people and remain unseen, I think I was able to prove that depending on the circumstances they could have pulled it off and gotten away in time, but there isn't really enough info to make a positive or negative assertion that it did or didn't happen. The only other relevant debate is around motive, which feels really weird because I'm discussing birds, but I just lean on the fact that nature isn't always optimized. Though I am yet to see video proof of a vulture vomiting after takeoff, it seems clear to me that they will sometimes lighten their load in the preparation that they may need to escape. It also seems possible that they will do this simply in response to other vultures doing it, which I'm sure is a useful adaptation in some scenarios that becomes redundant or even actively wasteful in a lot of others, but is nonetheless better to have. Maybe this is a small chance of playing out in the sky, but animals are both weird, consistent, and also inconsistent enough for me to allow it as a potential scenario. But that one last objection, why doesn't this happen anymore? Which, honestly, I haven't done any research into that. I don't even know if that'd be a good question to even ask. Maybe it does happen nowadays sometimes. But I'm saving all of those questions for my longer ORP video one day, so I'd encourage you to subscribe. Earlier on in this video, I teased some other theories, accounts of people saying this could have been a result of a dynamite explosion, that this was a conspiracy theory in order to encourage more people to move to Kentucky, aliens, because you always have to have aliens, multiversal wormholes, because if you ever have any trouble explaining anything, just say, oh, what if there's a multiverse? Murder scenes getting picked up by the wind, and cosmic meat belts sending meat asteroids to the Earth. Most of those theories were originally proposed as jokes, and I wanted to cover them just to kind of have fun with them and make fun of them, because they are pretty funny to read. But I want to keep this under an hour, hopefully. Citations should be on screen if you're interested enough to read them. They are pretty funny in my opinion, and they continue to confirm a thesis of this channel, and it's that newspaper writers from the 18th and 19th century are far better at writing satire than edgy zoomers in the 21st century. That is all for this video. I hope I was able to make it somewhat worth your time and attention. God bless. Have a good day. Bye. Outro time for me to ramble about something for 2 or 3 minutes. You want to know something interesting about this topic? I specifically chose it to be a shorter video. I'm pretty sure at this point this might be my longest video. Depends on if I'm over an hour or not. I wanted to try and choose shorter topics because I thought that would help me, get better at video making a bit quicker. Thought this would be like sub 20 minutes, but it just kept getting longer and longer and longer. This video has been more of a puzzle than any of my others. My last one on the Salt Lake whales, that one was more of like a info hunt, I'd say. This one just tested the limits of how far I can analyze something. I had the majority of the relevant info I'd use within like the first day, second day, or third day of research, and after that it was a few weeks of trying to fit everything together in my notes. I have oversold every prediction so far of how long I thought it would take me to make another video. If I can stay committed to actually trying to make it shorter, I feel like maybe I could have one out below 3 weeks of when this is uploaded. Let's see if I'm right this time. Anything else? Yeah, I'm glad I got to sneak in some talk about God this video. It's not like I'm gonna convert someone with that. I was basically just talking about random theology for like a minute or two. Hey, I did get to talk about it. That makes me happy. Miss Crouch, if you're looking down on me, I want to say thank you for your paranoia. It gave me a frivolous excuse to talk about our Savior. Okay, I think I'm done yapping. God bless. Goodbye. Which I'm pretty sure those two phrases back to back is like completely redundant. I'm pretty sure goodbye is a contraction of God be with you. Okay, goodbye.